This is part 4 of 7, diving into having 4K display on a phone. If you'd like to see the full episode, it's available right here, right now. Otherwise, let's jump into it.
Alright, so we've looked at this from a whole heap of different angles now. Let's take it up a notch and look at fonts. For all of these examples, I have adjusted the system font size so that they match the same physical size across all of the displays. The size that I've chosen is the size that I find most comfortable to read on a phone display, and it's noticeably smaller than the default font size. Matching them up was easier said than done, but in going to this effort, this allows us to match them up side by side like this, which makes it really easy to do some comparisons. Let's start with what we think of as the traditional RGB layout. Notice how the font rendering engine is trying to smooth off the edges of the font. It's doing this by sending incorrect color values to the display, and then that means that the different subpixel elements light up or don't light up accordingly. This is what gives you that colory, speckledy pattern around the edges of fonts that you see sometimes. This technique can improve how good fonts look by quite a considerable margin, but it requires the font rendering engine to know exactly the layout of the display. So one set of configuration can't simply be taken from one display to another and definitely work correctly. Now let's go and compare this to the Samsung S6 Edge. Notice how the font's starting to get a bit smoother, the edges are getting a little bit rounder, and there's a little bit less color bleeding. But now we go over to the S8. This is almost the same display density as the S6, but notice how smooth those fonts are now. They've done a really good job of anti-aliasing around the edges there. There's very little colour bleeding, and the edges are very well defined. Also notice how the shape of the font is beautifully preserved. Meanwhile, it sort of falls off. I think they've tried to mimic a ballpoint pen here, but that's just speculation. Notice that the very edges are not quite as well defined. I haven't spent enough time with this display to actually work out what my opinion is on it. My gut feeling is it's probably pretty good. It looks good. But like I say, I'd have to spend more time with it to really have a strong opinion. And now let's look at the 4K display of the Sony. Notice how sharp and round the edges are compared to the 1080p display. Let's try something slightly different. Let's look at some straighter characters like these. Notice how on the 4K display, still looks good. Same on the Samsung. But look what happens when we look at the 1080p display. Some of it is clear, and some of it is not. This is from a niche device where the display was not the focal point of the device. So I fired up a 1080p Pixel device in the Android Studio and configured the font so that it would match up with the other phones that I'm testing. And look at this. So it's happening in software there before it even gets to the display. So this blurriness is one of the manifestations of the blurriness that I see when I'm using a 1080p display. I actually had a really interesting conversation with a friend about this, and while we disagreed about which platforms we thought were better, he made a really good point that this might be fixable in software. It depends why the character is overflowing into the next row of pixels. If it's spacing or letter sizing, the way that could be fixed is different, and the consequences of fixing that could be different. And it may well be that the developers have consciously decided that a little bit of overflow is better than wiggling the spacing between the characters or making the letters uneven sizes. So assuming that they have made those decisions for those reasons, then having a higher resolution display is actually going to solve that problem. So we've talked about text edges. I'd like to bring up one more use case where I find the resolution very noticeable, and that's when I'm using a remote desktop. I find it very helpful to be able to zoom in and out of the desktop, and having a much higher resolution makes it much easier to find a scale in which the fonts and everything are easy to read.
Part 4 of 7, Fonts and Remote Desktop. We've talked about the side effects, the different methods of smoothing fonts, blurriness of fonts on the 1080p display, and the consequences of fixing that blurriness without increasing the resolution. If you'd like to see the full episode in its entirety, it's available right now there. And if you'd like to see the playlist of what's available so far, that's here, and like and subscribe.